Hi, I'm John Barclay and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we discuss the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. How's your week been, John?
Yeah, I've had a really good week working with lots of clients and keep exploring different opportunities around fatality prevention. So it's been a very busy week.
Do you find that this is a situation where the more you talk about something, the more you find it happening in real life? You know, that yellow car theory, as soon as you start talking or seeing yellow cars, you see them everywhere.
Yeah.
When you start talking about fatality-free future, you see, or the conversations about it come up everywhere.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of reasons for one. One is you're consciously paying attention to something. So you've just bought a yellow car or you're looking at yellow cars, so you see more of them. And I think it's the same here because I'm so focused on it as an individual, but as a business, I think it's driving the conversations. I find this whole conversation around social media really funny that, you'll be talking to someone about binoculars and then all of a sudden they're showing up on your feed about buying them, right? So I think there's a little bit of that going on as well, that I'm constantly talking about serious injuries and fatalities and it's sort of showing up on all the feeds. It's showing up in conversations with organisations. But I also think organisations are starting to pay attention to what's going on and starting to realise that while they may not be having fatalities, they have the potential for fatalities, and that's what they need to be staying really attentive to. So I think the conversations are changing as well, but I think it's probably coming from I'm prompting them.
Paying attention is going to be a theme today because we're going to be talking about precursors and amplifiers. And we've mentioned them a little bit as we've been going through these episodes, but today is our opportunity to deep dive into them, have a look at some of the descriptions, what are they, and maybe you'll bring a few stories to it. Where should we start? Should we start diving in with, tell us about what a precursor is?
Yeah, so a lot of the studies found when looking at incidents that the serious injuries and fatalities had precursors. So a precursor is something that comes before an event. So there were some common themes with that, and I think the main one is, especially around serious injuries and fatalities, is a precursor has a inherent risk, high risk, for a serious injury or a fatality. So it already has a significant damaging energy associated with it, and that damaging energy is related to certain types of activities. So a precursor fundamentally are activities that inherently have the potential for a fatality. The second part of precursors is probably a little bit more dynamic than that, in that it's the absence of or ineffective controls. So when we're constantly finding situations where we have a high-risk situation with commonly missing, absent or ineffective controls is the other one. Now the third part is, well, if that situation continues, it has a higher likely possibility of a fatality. So the longer that work continues without those controls, then that's has a high possibility of a fatality or at least a serious incident occurring.
So can you give us some examples? What would this look like in a workplace?
You can go find any studies that talk about common fatality events. So you can identify these things such as, working in confined spaces, working at height, working around suspended loads, working around mobile equipment, working with electricity, working with stored energy. Those have been well understood in regards to a precursor or a situational event that has the potential for a fatality. So you can start there, and I think most organisations could do that reasonably well and identify those reasonably well. The second part around controls is where I think organisations need to challenge themselves a bit around, are they absent and how often are they absent, the controls, whether it's an isolation, whether it's ventilation, whether it's exclusion zones, whether it's physical barriers separating machines and people. So whatever those controls are, how often are they absent? How often does work get done where they're absent? What I mean by that is you may have set up, say you're using in a warehouse and you've got a forklift operating, moving things around. You've got barricading everywhere, sort of separating the forklift and pedestrian walkways. But you have a lot of people going and testing, capturing data on pallets, product numbers or customer that it's going to, and been able to inform things. So you've set up a control, but there's an activity happening where they're bypassing that, and now that control's absent because you've got individuals in there working with the pallets while the forklift's operating. Or maybe you're loading a truck and the truck driver's in there moving around doing things with the truck while the forklift's operating. So yes, you've assessed the risk, you know you've got that risk, and you've put controls in place, you've got designated walkways and those sorts of hard barricading, but you have common scenarios where that control is absent.
It sounds like they're maybe not understanding what their precursors could be, or having that openness to exploring, okay, what haven't we thought about? So are there certain questions or ways people can be more active in looking at what their precursors could be?
I mean, the first question is actually, what activities are we performing that have a high risk potential to them? So forklift operations or confined spaces, working at height. So what high risk? So start with that. Then it's actually what situations in those activities present the likelihood of a fatality happening. And therefore that starts to ask some other questions around, so what would be the result of that? And then trying to understand, is it just a rolled ankle, or is it a amputation of a leg? And again, we've probably spoken about this. It needs to be a practical, like a reasonable outcome, not just stretching for a possible outcome. It needs to be a likely outcome of an event.
And you mentioned some common factors. Could you give us some examples of what those might be?
Besides the high-risk situations themselves, some other common factors that sit in precursors that we may overlook are things like work setup, work structures. So hours we're asking people to work. So 8-hour days, 10-hour days, 12-hour days, 14-day swings, 5-day swings, 4-week, whatever. So those can present themselves as precursors as well, right? Because they're changing the dynamic of the people that are interacting with those things. So it's understanding your risk profile, not just by the damage in energy, not just by the effectiveness of controls, but other organisational factors that may contribute to the precursor of that event happening as well.
Okay, so that's precursors. What about amplifiers? Can we get a definition on that one?
So amplifiers, in the simplest terms, are change in the context of the work that increases the likelihood or the severity of that risk. I've tried to understand them, and the looking that I've done in amplifier space, I've probably categorised them in two ways. There's situational amplifiers and there's people amplifiers. Because let's start with situational. Whatever the situation is, if there's a change in weather, that might change the likelihood or the severity of the outcome of that risk. If we change the scope, if we've gone from just cleaning out a tank to now welding in the tank, that changes the scope and it changes the risk profile, and some other things start to happen in there. Or I'm operating a forklift and I'm loading a truck, and the change of scope now is, well, I don't just need those 3 pallets, I need those 3 pallets as well. All of a sudden that now changes the loading sequence, and it can change the risk profile. So change of scope is a big one as well. Change of environment. So, if we've gone from wanting to do a piece of work in a controlled environment like a workshop, but now we've actually got to go do that work out in the open weather, then again, that can change the environment, can change the risk profile associated with that. And then any change of equipment. So if we've gone from having to use one type of welding to another type of welding, or having to use one type of crane to another type of crane, one type of forklift to another, or one elevated platform to another. So changing equipment changes profile. So simplest ways, change management for that. The interesting one about people, so people are quite complex, but there's some things that amplify different situations, and most commonly we talk about is people's risk perception. So different people can walk into the same situation with a different level of risk perception, and that can amplify the situation, right? It can create a changing dynamic because one person's not paying attention to a certain part of the work because they've done it many times and their risk perception is quite low, where someone else is getting a high level of risk association with that and is trying to do it differently, and therefore then they work against each other, and the process they're trying to do doesn't work properly, and therefore then you get an amplification of risk. Common term used is autopilot. As humans, we tend to work in the unconscious mind. We tend to work through things without having to necessarily think about it in detail. We like to work through things quite quickly. And the more often we get into autopilot, the more likely we are to have an amplifying situation where we miss a detail. We just miss that that's moved, or we miss that that's actually changed its position, or it's starting to leak, or whatever it is. Because we're operating in autopilot, we may not be paying attention to change. The other one from people is, this is going to sound quite harsh when people, we like to do things the easiest and quickest way. So
Efficient.
I'll call it efficiency. Yeah, some people call it laziness. But if we don't have the right equipment, the right tooling, easily accessible, we're quite innovative. We can get away with doing work without using necessarily the best tool for the job. So, if we don't make the safest piece of equipment or tool, then people may use the wrong tool or the wrong piece of equipment, or may not even use the control that we want to do, like a drop mat. If the drop mats aren't easily available, they may not use them. If we don't have the right barricading tape easily available, they may use the wrong one. So it's about making sure things are accessible for people, and that allows them to do that. And then the one which we've spoken about a couple of times is culture, so that normalisation of deviation. If it's normal to do jobs a certain way without paying attention to certain controls, then that's an amplifier as well. And I guess the distinction here, sometimes we'll talk about a precursor and it might sound like an amplifier. Sometimes we'll talk about an amplifier and it will sound like a precursor. I think my general advice here is think about them both in context to the work. Don't stress about, is that an amplifier? Is that a precursor? I wouldn't really stress too much about those. I guess the main point around this is these things change every day and they change throughout the day. And what we should be paying closer attention to is understanding those risks, but understand the precursors and amplifiers that go on and change every day.
Could you give us an example, maybe set us somewhere and tell us about how a day with some work going on the risk could change as we work our way from morning to afternoon?
I think there's lots of different examples. I think I'll use one where start of the morning, we've done a pre-start, we've identified the jobs that we're doing today and the risks associated with it. We've come up with how we're going to control them and the process for that. So the team gets organised. They go out to the job and they start to set up for that job. But then all of a sudden the supervisor's been informed that, hey, we need to go over and do another job, right? Because that's taken some priority and that's taken some urgency. So because we've shifted the same crew over to another job, because it was urgent, maybe they didn't spend as much time planning, understanding the risks and the controls. And because it's a job they've done before, they get into this normalisation, get into this autopilot, fast action. So put up the basic controls and then get in and start doing it. But haven't recognised that today, going over and doing that job, it's still energised, or it's still got pressure in it, or maybe hasn't had time to cool down and it's still a couple of 100 degrees, right? So those are the sorts of examples where we've changed scope, we've changed job, they've gone out with a really good plan for one job, but then right at the last minute we've had to go over here and do this job. Another scenario, say that actually did go well and they did plan that change of job well, but now they've gone back to the other one and gone with the original plan, but haven't quite realised that now someone else is working above them, because when they were doing it in the morning, there was no simultaneous operations happening, or sim ops. So there weren't people working above them, so they didn't have that as a risk profile to start with. But now that they're 4 hours later in the day, they go there and the other crew have scheduled their work because they thought they'd be finished by now, and now they're working above them. So those are examples where these amplifiers and precursors shift all throughout the day if we're not paying attention to them.
And whose job is it to pay attention?
Great question. I think at the end of the day, there are planners, there are people dedicated to planning, scheduling and allocating work to work crews. So I think ultimately it's their responsibility to think about those nuances, because if you're going to change a plan, someone needs to own the process of that. Saying that, I think the work crews still have an element of awareness, situational awareness to happen, to say, hey, something's changed, so now we need to reset that whole plan, or at least readjust the plan. So I think everyone has a responsibility in there, but if I was ultimately to say the accountability sits with whoever's allocating work to crews, needs to take accountability for any significant change, which is an amplifier to risk. So if we're changing something, that's a big amplifier. You need to make sure there's time spent understanding the implications of that change.
Do you have any examples when you've been on site and maybe picked up on a precursor or an amplifier that's just not been picked up by anybody else?
Working at height's a pretty common one. So what I mean by that is, as a precursor, it's about controls or the ineffectiveness of a control. So there was a scenario where the people were working at height. There was about a 2.5 metre fall. It was a round exposure, and normally they would have a hookup point above them, directly above them, which would stop them falling into the hole. But over the last few months, that anchor point had been removed for some other work. So now they were using anchor points to the side of the piece of equipment, which actually meant, depending on where you're working, you didn't have enough tension on your restraint to stop you from falling. So if you're working on one side, you had a lot of slack in your restraint, and therefore then you could fall. On the other side, you'd be fine. So the precursor there was just an ineffectiveness of control, and no one had really picked up on it, and there was a compliance orientated thinking, I'm hooked up, I'm all good. But no, your hookup was really ineffective, and a person had fallen. Luckily, it wasn't too serious an injury. It was not a nice injury, but it wasn't a serious injury or a fatality. But that was another example where, because the check-in was, are they hooked up? Yes. Was it effective? No. Another one pretty typical is in scaffolding. People start to use harnesses and hook on to just anything, and sometimes they're not approved anchor points. And how often do we really check and understand what are we hooking up to, and are they actually an approved anchor point? Because if they're not, they can fail, or they can bend and break. And there are scenarios and there are examples where someone's hooked up to the pipe and it hasn't been secured properly yet, so when they've put tension on it, the pipe's let go and they've fallen. So, I think those are examples where we don't assess the effectiveness of the control, and that's what we mean by it. We're now allowing the controls to become a precursor rather than just the risk itself. The ineffectiveness of the control is normal, and therefore then it becomes a precursor.
Do you have any examples of an amplifier that's been people-based?
Probably the most common one is fatigue, and some organisations do fly in and fly out. So, the long swings, long days, or switching from days to night all accumulate to a level of fatigue. And having a conversation with a crew, I was starting to get curious around, well, what stage of the swing are you in? Or on a three-week rotation with one week away, so a 3 and 1. This person also lived on the east coast of Australia. Their 1 week off was really only about 4 days off, because by the time you included the travel home, have a few days off and then start travelling back, they weren't really having the full 7 days, having about 4.5, 5 days.
Wow.
Right? So actually starting to unpack that a bit with the person, you could see the level of fatigue setting in after quite a few swings. And what was happening there was just the risk perception was changing, autopilot was increasing, paying attention to detail was dropping off. If we hadn't have had that conversation and got that person to actually understand what they need to do to manage that in the last few days of their swing, then that could have led to a significant amplifier to that person just making a very simple error, which is human nature when you're fatigued.
And what about a situational amplifier? Any examples for that one?
Yeah, there's always plenty there. I mean, the obvious one's weather, especially when we're doing things like using cranes and doing lifts. I see organisations getting a lot better at this now about monitoring the weather and seeing that the wind's picking up today, and therefore then they may reschedule the lift. But I still see organisations saying it's not coming into 1 o'clock, so we'll go. But the wind starts to pick up around 10, 11, but they're not paying attention to that as much because they'd got a plan to do this lift by lunchtime. It'd be finished by 1 when the wind comes up. So the weather's changed. It didn't go to plan. The weather doesn't always come in on clockwork, right? So I still see them go ahead with lifts even though the wind's picking up, and that's amplifying that situation.
Something you mentioned earlier is that sometimes people will do workarounds to get a job done because maybe they don't have access to something, or, something's happened along the way where the workers just needed to have a way of being easier. Where does that come into this? Is that an accessibility issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about this as behaviours being enabled or non-enabled, right? And so if we want someone to use drop mats, then they should be right there for people to use. What I'll hear in organisations is, well, they're expected to use them. I expect them to take the time to go get them. Okay. Well, that from time to time may be an unrealistic expectation, depending on what other expectations you've put on the team. So if you put an expectation on the team to get that pump removed by 10 o'clock, and they all get out there and then realise that they're going to have to do a lot of that work in an open area, and therefore then they need some drop mats. But it's only going to take them 20 minutes to sort of do that work, but it's going to take them 40 minutes to go get some drop mats and come back and set it all up. Now, I can sit here as a leader and go, well, that's your expectation. I expect you to go spend 40 minutes and actually go and set up some drop mats. But depending on what's happened in the past, people may quickly evaluate that risk based on other factors such as, well, what happens if we don't get it complete by 10 o'clock? Okay, we might delay production startup, which is going to cost $1 million. That's the way people think. They weigh up those things pretty quickly. So if we don't set up work correctly, where the critical controls aren't prepared to be enabled for people to use, then we run the risk of accessibility or enablement to become an issue. And drop mats is a pretty common one. The amount of times I go out and talk to crews, and one of their critical risks is dropped objects. Yes, they'll set up their exclusion zone, which is great because that keeps people out of the drop zone. But I'll notice they're not using drop mats. And a couple of things will happen, right? Well, I've already got a drop zone. It's going to take me too long to go get a drop mat and set it up. So I'm just going to continue working and get the job done. And people weigh those things up all the time. And we can debate whether that's right or wrong, right? That's just reality. And I think that's the other bit around accessibility. We've got to move past our own perception of what's reasonable and really get a sense of understanding around what our work crews feel is reasonable. And drop mats is a pretty common one. I think taglines with suspended loads is another common one. We say they need a tagline, so we just put a rope on it. As the load's going up, the rope's dangling below the load anyway, so for the person to grab it, they've got to go underneath the load, which is not what you want them to do. I don't think we truly understand the implications of accessibility for the right tools and the right equipment to actually manage the risk effectively. I think we just tick the box that, hey, we've got a tagline, hey, we've got drop mats, and we expect people just to use them.
In this conversation, I'm really hearing that this has got to be such an active process. It can't be passive. It's something you've got to think about every day. Do you have any advice for the people listening or watching about how they can integrate this into their everyday activities or make it a bit of a habit to be on the lookout for these things?
Understanding your critical risks, which we've spoken about in many episodes. Know those fatality potential events. Understand your critical controls. But when you're going out and verifying all of that, understand those general precursors in your business and understand the amplifying situations and investigate them. Right? Really understand, yes, the critical controls are hookup, right? Being hooked up and having a harness on. But is that really effective? Like, you know, is it actually an effective control, not just a control that's in place? So I encourage people and organisations to think about what are the things that affect the effectiveness of their controls, and check those as well. Don't just go, yeah, the controls there, tick. You know, what are the things that impact the effectiveness of those, and check on those as well.
Right. Thank you very much, John, for another insightful episode.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.